The Forbidden Aqueducts of Tartaria. Technology we still can't explain. Have you ever stood in front of an old aqueduct and really seen it? Not just snapped a picture of the arches against a blue sky, or driven past it on a highway thinking, wow, that's old. I mean actually stopped and tried to imagine what it would take to build something like that, with the tools we're told they had. Miles of stone channels, perfectly sloped so that water flows smoothly for tens, sometimes hundreds of kilometers. Without pumps, without electricity, without digital calculations. Blocks weighing several tons, lifted and set with such precision that some joints are so tight you can't even slip a knife between them. Structures that have survived earthquakes, wars, floods, and centuries of neglect. While our modern water systems crack, leak, and fail in a few decades. That's where this story begins. With the Forbidden Aqueducts of Tartaria, the ghost infrastructure of a civilization we're told never existed. For months, I've been diving into old maps, engineering manuals, dusty photographs, and city archives. Everywhere I looked, the pattern repeated, the same bland explanation stamped over and over again. Built with local stone and manual labor. That's it. That's the entire story we're given for systems so advanced they still work now, even after being abandoned, buried, or chopped into pieces to make way for highways and apartment blocks. The more you study these aqueducts, the less sense the official story makes. All over the world, from Europe to Asia, from North Africa to the Americas, you find traces of vast waterworks that don't quite fit their surroundings, or their assigned era. Enormous arcades marching across valleys, underground channels carved with machine-like precision, circular towers and mysterious water houses placed at mathematically perfect intervals, as if they were part of a much larger grid. And yet, in the history books, these aren't marvels of an unknown technology. They're just Roman style, Ottoman era, medieval public works. Whenever something looks too advanced, it's blamed on Roman influence. If it's even more advanced than that, it's quietly labelled origin uncertain and the discussion moves on. But when you start lining up the details, you notice something strange. Some of these aqueducts have no real construction records, only renovation reports. Many appear on older maps decades before their official completion dates. Others show up in paintings and drawings attributed to earlier centuries, already standing in the landscape, already part of the city. It's as if these water systems were inherited, not created. The further I dug, the clearer it became that we might not be looking at simple Roman remnants or early modern engineering at all. We might be looking at the leftovers of a completely different paradigm. A world where water wasn't just for drinking and bathing, but for something much bigger. Because here's the part that nobody talks about. These aqueducts don't just move water, they shape it. The channels are often carved with repeating patterns and specific angles, forcing water into spirals, vortices, and controlled turbulence. Many of the towers and basins are placed at precise elevations, as if tuned to pressure, resonance, and maybe even frequency. Some cisterns look less like storage tanks and more like resonant chambers. Mainstream history, it's just gravity and good masonry, nothing to see here. But if it's really that simple, why can't we easily replicate it now? Why do modern engineers admit that rebuilding certain ancient water systems to their original specs would be too expensive, too complex, or unnecessary? Why did so many cities choose to abandon perfectly functioning gravity-fed systems and replace them with fragile, energy-hungry networks of pumps and pipes? Unless, of course, those old systems were doing more than just delivering water. As I kept comparing structures across continents, the coincidences piled up. Identical geometric patterns cut into stone channels thousands of kilometers apart. The same ratios in arch spans, tower heights, and reservoir dimensions. Aqueduct terminals that line up with old star maps and geomagnetic anomalies, and over again, that same architectural fingerprint you find in so-called Tartarian buildings. Impossible precision, harmony of proportion, ornament disguised as function. It's the same language, the same anonymous hand. And yet, nobody calls these Tartarian aqueducts. They're renamed, rebranded, absorbed into safer labels. Roman, Byzantine, colonial. Anything but what they truly hint at. A worldwide network of water-based technology that doesn't fit our story of slow, linear progress. In old travel accounts, some of these aqueduct sites are described as having unusual air, a strange freshness. Even reports of faint humming or vibration near certain towers and distribution points. Locals treated them as sacred, healing even. Places where the water was considered alive or stronger than normal. What if that wasn't superstition? What if they were sensing something our instruments no longer look for? In this documentary, we're going to follow the forgotten channels. We'll trace the remains of aqueducts that cross borders, timelines, and official narratives. We'll compare the engineering to what we claim to know today, and ask why our best explanations still fall short. We'll look at the structures that have been dismantled, dynamited, or buried beneath modern cities. The waterworks that were quietly shut down in the 19th and 20th centuries. Right as a new world order of industry, electricity, and centralized control was rising. And we'll ask a dangerous question. What if these aqueducts weren't just plumbing? What if they were part of an ancient energy network, one built on water, resonance, and geometry, that we have inherited, misunderstood, and then deliberately erased? In the Forbidden Aqueducts of Tartaria, technology we still can't explain. We're going to follow the flow all the way back to its source, because once you see what's been hiding in plain sight, you'll never look at an old stone channel or a glass of water the same way again. The first clues, aqueducts that shouldn't exist. When you hear the word aqueduct, you think of Rome. Giant stone arches, broken in places, proudly sitting in a field like the ribs of a fossilized giant. You don't think of Siberia. You don't think of Mongolia. You don't think of abandoned valleys in Eastern Europe, where no major empire supposedly built anything. And yet, that's exactly where the first inconsistencies begin. Because scattered across Eurasia are structures nobody can comfortably explain. Massive spanning bridges with no river beneath them, long linear corridors of stone following impossible gradients, and most bizarre of all, stone channels with machine-perfect interiors carved into materials that should have shattered long before any hand tool touched them. Official explanations. Local irrigation works. Minor civil structures, early industrial channels for mills that no longer exist. Really? We're talking about stone channels cut smoother than many modern concrete forms, stretching over terrain so uneven that even building a dirt road today would require heavy machinery. But here's the detail that started everything for me. Many of these aqueducts are built in places where the population, historically, was too small to even justify such a project. villages of 300 people, yet nearby stands a stone hydraulic system that would require a workforce of hundreds for several years. So who built them, and why? That question alone opens the door to Tartaria. Following the impossible gradient. One of the strangest features of these so-called forbidden aqueducts is their insane precision. Water engineering is simple in theory. Water flows downhill. But to transport water over long distances efficiently, the gradient must be extraordinarily specific, often a few millimeters per meter. Now imagine maintaining that precision over 20, 50 or even 80 kilometers, without lasers, without GPS, without surveying equipment. Roman aqueducts achieved gradients around 0.1% to up 3%, a technological miracle in their own time. But these Tartarian-style aqueducts, some sections measure 1.0%, even 1.02%. That's beyond Roman precision. That's beyond medieval capabilities. That's borderline impossible, even during the Renaissance, without specialized instruments. And yet, they're here, cutting across forests, mountains, and plains, as if whoever built them had the ability to see the land, the way modern satellite topography sees it today. Either they had advanced surveying instruments we've never found, or they had knowledge we don't attribute to early Eurasian societies. Whichever answer you choose, it doesn't fit the official story. The stonework, an undeniable anomaly. Let's talk craftsmanship. Many of these aqueducts feature stone channels polished from the inside, perfect 90-degree wall junctions, identical blocks repeated across dozens of kilometers, mortarless joints so tight can't fit a blade inside, and in some cases, tool marks resembling circular saws. Circular saws. In the 17th century. In rural areas with no access to industrial equipment. The official reports never mention these marks. They zoom in on the local limestone, the traditional methods, the low-tech construction, and they leave the uncomfortable details out. Or they simply don't look. Instead, they hide behind the same fallback phrase. The origin of the structure is uncertain, but likely medieval. Likely. As in, we don't actually know. But the stone knows. Stone never lies. And when you study it closely, you can't shake the feeling that these aren't just water channels. They were engineered with an intention so precise, so deliberate, so cleverly executed, that calling them primitive feels almost disrespectful. Traces of a power system. Here's where things get even stranger. Certain Tartarian aqueducts show burn marks. Not chaotic, destructive burns, but controlled heating patterns consistent with steam or thermal cycling. In other words, they may not have carried only water. Some researchers propose they were part of hydraulic power systems, using water pressure to drive simple turbines or mechanical lifts, technology that shouldn't have existed regionally until the 19th century. Others go further. They think these aqueducts were part of a massive, interconnected hydraulic grid used to regulate pressure, flow, and possibly even energy distribution across large urban areas. Remember, Tartaria, whether you see it as a forgotten empire or a misinterpreted period of Eurasian history, is repeatedly described in old maps as containing extremely advanced and populous cities. Cities that apparently vanished. Cities whose infrastructure is missing. What if it's not missing? What if it's just been reclassified as medieval irrigation because that's easier than rewriting history textbooks? Some aqueducts feature branching nodes shaped like distribution hubs channels that widen and narrow rhythmically, like pressure regulators and chambers that resemble hydraulic buffers. These aren't built just to get water from one hill to a village. This looks like engineering from a civilization comfortable with fluid dynamics, not simply agriculture. The water itself, an unexpected clue. When you study aqueducts, you eventually realize the builders weren't just moving water, they were treating it. Certain Tartarian channels show layers of natural filtration, fine sand charcoal deposits, porous stone segments, and strange patterns hinting at electrohydraulic effects. Some sections even show residues of diatomaceous earth, which is normally used to purify water at a microscopic level. Ancient civilizations used charcoal filters, yes, but diatomaceous filtration, that's modern. So why are traces of it embedded inside centuries-old stonework? And even more interesting, why does the water flowing through the few still active sections remain unusually clear, even without modern purification? It suggests something revolutionary. These aqueducts were multi-purpose systems, not just for drinking, not just for pressure, but perhaps for something else entirely. What else requires perfectly clean, sediment-free water? Machines. Complex ones. Machines we haven't found. Machines that would explain the precision, the power, the placement, and the impossible uniformity of these structures. Patterns in the map. An uncomfortable discovery. Let's talk geography. When you plot the locations of these aqueducts on a modern map, a pattern emerges. They're not random. They form geometric alignments, equal distances between nodes, repeating angles, and in certain regions. Fractal-like layouts. This does not match agricultural needs. This does not match medieval town placement. This does not match colonial expansion. But it does match something. Urban planning. Massive urban planning. At a scale far beyond what these regions are credited with historically. Some alignments even correspond to old city locations recorded on 16th and 17th century maps, but no longer acknowledged today. Cities that supposedly never existed. Cities labeled as Tartar capitals by early explorers. Cities erased when imperial borders were redrawn. Are the aqueducts the last physical traces of these forgotten cities? It certainly looks that way. The vanishing blueprints. In normal archaeological research, you find documents, blueprints, sketches, ledgers, tax records. But for these aqueducts, nothing. Not one original construction drawing, not one record of their builders, not one description of their purpose, not one local oral tradition explaining how they were made. It is as if someone took a giant eraser and scrubbed away the historical origin. The silence becomes suspicious when you look at restoration reports from the 19th century. Europe and Asia saw major modernizations then. Railways, canals, roads. And guess what happened during that same period? Thousands of ancient hydraulic structures were dismantled, repurposed, buried, or destroyed under the label of obsolete medieval works. Why destroy something medieval if it still works? Why break it apart unless it was misunderstood? Or worse, unless it didn't fit the acceptable narrative of progress? The architects without a name now comes one of the strangest recurring elements. Several aqueducts contain inscriptions, but the scripts are half erased, partially stylized, and written in alphabets resembling Old Cyrillic, Persian, and Latin simultaneously. Experts call them graffiti. But some of these marks appear on foundational blocks, meaning they were carved before construction, not after. Some symbols are consistent across hundreds of kilometers. Not common folk symbols, not religious markings, engineering symbols. Why do they occur across multiple countries? Why do they match no known construction guild? And who was standardizing these signs centuries before international engineering codes existed? Unless, of course, these structures were all part of a shared civilization. A civilization spread across Eurasia. A civilization with standardized engineering. A civilization whose name has been either forgotten or deliberately removed. The silent testimony of water flow. One of the simplest ways to understand an aqueduct is to pour water into it and see what happens. Modern researchers did precisely that with several restored segments. Here's what happened. The water didn't flow like a simple channel. It accelerated in certain areas. It created vortexes in others. It stabilized itself in long, straight runs. This is not random. This is fluid engineering. The interior geometry appears designed to increase speed where needed, reduce pressure, naturally filter sediment, and maintain laminar flow over long distances. This is something hydraulic engineers today still calculate with complex software. But someone did it with stone, hundreds of years ago. Either they stumbled into perfect design by accident, which is statistically absurd, or they knew exactly what they were doing. And here's the strangest thing. These vortex sections create something close to hydroelectric potential, even without electricity. Meaning, if someone did attach early mechanical devices to these channels, they could have extracted continuous mechanical power for free. A forgotten green energy grid, right under our feet. When modern engineers try to replicate them, several universities have attempted to reconstruct sections of these aqueducts using officially documented historical tools and methods. The results: complete failure. The stones crack, the channels warp. The gradient is impossible to maintain. The joints leak. One engineer admitted anonymously, "Even with modern equipment, replicating certain segments is more difficult than it should be. Something is missing from the official explanation." Something. Maybe knowledge. Maybe tools. Maybe an entire chapter of engineering history. The unspoken consensus. Here's what historians, engineers, and archaeologists won't say publicly, but quietly agree upon when the cameras are off. These aqueducts don't fit anywhere. Not in Roman systems, not in medieval systems, not in early modern systems. The techniques used appear too advanced for medieval societies, too uniform for local builders, too precise for hand tools, too widespread to be accidental, and the biggest red flag of all. There is no known culture that used these exact construction methods. None. So where did they come from? The Tartarian theory. What if these were not aqueducts at all? Now we get to the hypothesis that makes mainstream historians uncomfortable. What if we're calling them the wrong thing entirely? Maybe they weren't simply water carriers. Maybe they were. Cooling channels, pressure conduits, mechanical power lines, energy distribution systems, or even groundwork for larger machines or megastructures. In some regions, these channels connect to old star forts, underground reservoirs, abandoned industrial-like chambers, and massive foundations that have no matching buildings above them anymore. Were these aqueducts feeding water into star forts for pressure regulation? Were they powering early industrial equipment? Were they part of a geothermal hydraulic system? Or a transportation network? Everything points to them being far more than a simple utility. They feel like the arteries of something larger, something intelligent, something organized, something erased. The one thing every structure has in common, no matter which aqueduct you study, Eastern, Western, Northern, or Southern Eurasia, there is always one recurring theme. They are built to last forever. Not decades, not centuries, forever. The material choices, the interlocking stone designs, the self-cleaning flow patterns, the redundant supports. Everything screams durability. This wasn't rushed. This wasn't experimental. This wasn't local improvisation. This was the product of a civilization that expected their work to be used for thousands of years. A civilization with confidence, a civilization with mastery, a civilization we do not officially acknowledge. But their fingerprints are everywhere. So who built them, and why are we just hearing about this now? The official answer: unknown builders, simple irrigation. The unofficial answer: a civilization with hydraulic knowledge, at least on par with early modern engineers, possibly far more advanced. A civilization capable of surveying vast distances, machining stone with impossible precision, creating pressure systems, aligning infrastructure across entire regions. Call it Tartaria. Call it a forgotten empire. Call it a suppressed chapter of history. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that these aqueducts, these forbidden aqueducts, are not mistakes. They are not folklore. They are not agricultural leftovers. They are evidence. Evidence of something older, something bigger, something we are only beginning to understand. And the deeper you dig, literally and historically, the more obvious it becomes. We've been walking over the ruins of an engineering culture we don't recognize, yet their work still flows beneath the soil, waiting to be understood. In the end, the Forbidden Aqueducts of Tartaria leave us with more questions than answers. We can measure the stones, map the channels, carbon date the mortar, but none of it explains why these structures seem so far ahead of their time. None of it explains the precision, the impossible alignments, or the silent refusal of history to acknowledge them. Maybe these aqueducts belonged to a civilization that mastered water the way we master electricity. Maybe they inherited knowledge we've long forgotten. Or maybe, just maybe, we are looking at the last traces of a world that was never meant to survive. A chapter torn out before the book was even finished. What we do know is this: the more we uncover, the less the official story seems to hold. And every new discovery hints at something bigger, something still hidden, something waiting. So the next time you walk past an old stone channel or a strange archway in the countryside, look closer. Because history doesn't just hide its secrets. Sometimes it buries them right in front of us.